Creepy things that were normal in medieval times. We must first dismantle our modern walls. Not the stone ones of the castle, but the invisible barriers of selfhood. In the medieval world, the very concept of a private life, as we understand it, was not just elusive, it was nonsensical. The individual was a node in a dense web of community, faith, and hierarchy, and every aspect of existence was subject to a collective gaze that would feel, to us, profoundly intrusive and creepy. The body as public forum. Your body was not your own. It was a signifier, a piece of communal property, and a potential source of pollution or sanctity. This began at birth. The laboring mother was attended not just by a midwife, but by a gaggle of female neighbors and relatives. The act of birth was a social event, shrouded in ritual and superstition. The afterbirth was handled with extreme care, often buried in sacred ground to prevent witches from using it for maleficium. The newborn was immediately thrust into the public sphere through baptism, an urgent sacrament performed within days to wash away the stain of original sin. Delay risked the infant's soul to the terrifying limbo of unbaptized souls. Bodily functions lacked our veil of shame. In manor houses and castles, guardrobes latrines often emptied directly into moats or cesspits, their smells a constant backdrop. In towns, chamber pots were emptied from upper windows into the street with a warning shout of "Gardez-le," from the French "Regarde-le," watch out for the water. But more fundamentally, the health and humors of the body were daily conversation. The color of your urine, the consistency of your stools, the phase of the moon at which you were bled by the barber surgeon, these were not private medical details but points of interest and diagnosis for your household. Illness was a public spectacle. The sickbed was a stage where drama between sin, demonic influence, and divine will played out. Neighbors would visit, not just to comfort, but to witness, to pray loudly, and to offer often gruesome folk remedies. Sleep, too, was communal. The great hall of a castle saw the lord and lady retiring to a curtained-off bed, while servants and retainers slept on pallets on the rushes of the floor. In peasant cottages, the entire family, and often the valuable livestock, shared a single room. The acts of sex, of intimate conversation, of solitary reflection, were hemmed in by the palpable presence of others. There was no alone. The community as judge and jury. Law was not a distant abstraction but a visceral, participatory theater. The modern horror of mob justice was, in many ways, the normal judicial process. Trial by ordeal was not mere brutality, it was a sacrament, a judicium Dei judgment of God. In the ordeal of hot iron, an accused would carry a red-hot bar for 9 feet. Their hand was then bandaged. If, after 3 days, the wound was festering, God had proclaimed their guilt. If it was healing cleanly, God proclaimed their innocence. The community watched, prayed, and awaited divine verdict. The accused's body literally bore witness against them, a chilling fusion of flesh and dogma. Similarly, compurgation involved the accused swearing an oath of innocence, backed by a certain number of oath helpers who would swear to his trustworthiness. Your life and liberty depended not on forensic evidence, but on the social capital you could muster. If you were an outsider, a loner, or unpopular, you were deemed. The community's opinion was not just gossip, it was legally binding. Public punishment was designed not just to deter, but to remake the criminal's body into a moral lesson. The pillory forced the offender to stand, neck and wrists locked, while the townspeople hurled not just insults, but rotten food, stones, and excrement. A forger might have a hand struck off, the severed member nailed up for all to see. The executed corpse, left to rot on a gibbet at a crossroads, was a standard landmark. These broken bodies were integrated into the daily landscape, a constant, grisly reminder of the consequences of transgressing the communal will. The invisible tapestry, the supernatural in the everyday. The medieval world was thin. The veil between the material and the spiritual was permeable, and beings from the other side leaked through constantly. This wasn't creepy to them, it was the weather of existence. Saints and relics. Devotion was physical, even grotesque. The bones of saints were not hidden away but displayed in glorious reliquaries, kissed, touched, and paraded through streets. People sought healing by sleeping on tombs, hoping for a curative dream. A vial of a saint's blood, a tooth, a finger bone. These were the most precious possessions of a town, sources of power and protection. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to see a skull encrusted in gems, a mummified hand. The holy and the macabre were inseparable. The dead among the living. Graveyards were not secluded, melancholic places. They were in the very center of community life, adjacent to the church. They functioned as marketplaces, meeting grounds, and playgrounds. People conducted business on top of graves, children played hide-and-seek among the markers, and festivals were held there. The dead were considered part of the parish community, asleep until resurrection. Their physical presence was a daily fact. This intimacy took a darker turn with the doctrine of purgatory. The dead were not gone, they were suffering, and they needed your help. Masses for the dead, paid for by the living, were a massive industry. The chill you might feel wasn't just the wind, it could be a soul in torment, begging for prayer. Ghosts were not rare horror tropes but commonly accepted visitants, often with very specific requests to rectify unfinished earthly business. Witches and the malicious eye. Before the great witch crazes of the early modern period, belief in witchcraft was woven into the fabric of daily risk. A failed harvest, a stillborn calf, a sudden illness, these could be the work of a neighbor's malice. The evil eye was a constant fear. Wise men and women, cunning folk, were consulted for protective charms, amulets, and countermagic. Milk could be stolen from a cow by magical means. Love potions and curses were part of the underground economy of social conflict. To live was to navigate a landscape buzzing with invisible forces, where a stray compliment could be a covert curse if not punctuated with a protective gesture like spitting or touching iron. The world as a book of symbols. Nothing was merely itself. The physical world was a dense manuscript written by God, and every creature, every object, was a sign pointing to a higher spiritual truth. This symbolic thinking infused everything with a kind of eerie resonance. Animals as criminals. There are numerous records of animals being put on trial for crimes. A village might formally prosecute a plague of locusts, a herd of pigs that killed a child, or rats that destroyed grain. They were assigned legal counsel, witnesses were called, and sentences were passed, often excommunication, a powerful spiritual weapon, or execution. This seems absurd to us, but it was perfectly logical in a world where all creation was subject to divine law and moral order. The animal's crime was a disruption of that order that had to be ritually corrected. Portents and prophecy. Unusual events were never just coincidences. A comet was an omen of a king's death. A two-headed calf born on a farm was a dire warning of divine displeasure. Dreams were meticulously analyzed for prophetic content. The line between the natural and the supernatural was blurry. Strange weather, astronomical events, and birth defects were all pages in the Book of God's Will, demanding interpretation by priests, scholars, and the anxious populace. The aesthetics of mortality, memento mori. In an age of plagues like the Black Death, which wiped out half of Europe, death was a constant companion. The response was not to hide it away, but to stare at it, to integrate it into art and daily thought. This is where the medieval sensibility becomes most viscerally alien to us. The dance macabre, a popular artistic motif, depicted the dance of death, a grinning, rotting corpse leading people from all walks of life, pope, emperor, knight, peasant, in a dance to the grave. It was on church walls, in manuscripts, in performances. Its message was stark and egalitarian: as you are, we were. As we are, you shall be. Trancy tombs, effigies on tombs often show the deceased in two forms: above, in their splendid robes of state; below, as a naked, decaying cadaver, being eaten by worms. This was not considered morbid, but profoundly pious, a reminder of the vanity of earthly glory and the ultimate fate of the flesh. The use of human remains. Beyond relics, human bones were architectural features. Ossuaries, like the famous catacombs of Paris, though later, the practice continued, arranged skulls and femurs into decorative patterns. The body, even in death, was material to be used for meditation on eternity. The message was inescapable: you are temporary. Your beauty, your power, your wealth, all will become this. The hierarchy of pain. Suffering was not an unmitigated evil. It was a pathway to grace, an imitation of Christ's passion. Extreme asceticism was admired, not seen as mental illness. Mystics like Marjorie Kemp wept voluminous tears for hours on end, her public displays of holy grief both unsettling and revered. Flagellants, groups of penitents who wandered from town to town publicly whipping themselves to atone for society's sins, were a periodic and terrifying spectacle. Their bloody rituals were seen as a powerful, if radical, spiritual medicine. The deliberate seeking of pain to achieve spiritual purity is a concept that profoundly disturbs our modern, comfort-oriented minds. The serf and the social body. For the vast majority, the peasantry, creepiness was not supernatural, it was baked into the very structure of existence. A serf was not a slave, but he was unfree. He was bound to the land, and his body was, in a sense, an extension of that land. He owed his lord not just rent, but labor, a portion of his harvest, and a dizzying array of often humiliating fees. The merchant, a serf, needed his lord's permission, and had to pay a tax for his daughter to marry. Her virginity and reproductive capacity were, in a legal sense, the lord's property. Harriet, the best beast of a deceased serf, his best cow, horse, etc., was forfeit to the lord upon his death. The lord had a claim on the very body of his laborer, even in mortality. The rite of primi noctis droit du seigneur, the mythical rite of the first night, is largely a later legend, but it speaks to a pervasive reality: the lord's power over the serf's body was near absolute. The lord was a petty god in his domain, his will constrained more by custom than by any enforceable code of rights for the underclass. The psychological weight of this, the knowledge that your life, your family, your body were not truly your own, must have created a low-grade, constant existential dread far more penetrating than any ghost story. The gaze that never blinks. So, what is fundamentally creepy about the medieval world, from our vantage point? It is the total lack of existential buffer. We moderns cushion ourselves with privacy, with individual rights, with a scientific worldview that mostly banishes spirits and symbolic meaning from the material world. We outsource our violence to prisons and our dead to funeral homes. We treat pain as a malfunction to be medicated. The medieval person lived in a state of immersive exposure. Their body was public, their thoughts were subject to confession, their behaviors were policed by the community, their fate was tied to unseen forces and rigid hierarchies, and their ultimate decay was a favorite artistic theme. The world was alive with intention: gods, the devils, the saints, the witches, the lords. There was no neutral space, no room to simply be without being part of a dense, often oppressive, web of meaning and power. The creepy things weren't aberrations, they were the mortar between the stones of their reality. To step into that world would be to feel a gaze upon you at all times, the gaze of your neighbors, your lord, your priest, your ancestors, and the ever-watchful eyes of God and his angels, or the devil and his minions. It was a world without psychological solitude, where the strange was normal, the gruesome was instructive, and the supernatural was just another thread in the fabric of a very long, very cold, and very consequential day. The fabric of fear and faith. Having explored the communal and physical intrusions of medieval life, we must now descend into the psychological and epistemological frameworks that made such a world not only functionable but sensible. The creepiness was not in isolated horrors, but in the very architecture of thought. The ecology of fear, a landscape of active hostility. The medieval world was not a safe space. This is an understatement. Danger was not an interruption of peace, it was the expected condition. But this danger was not merely physical, it was moral, spiritual, and woven into the environment itself. The wilderness as a moral vacuum. Beyond the cleared fields of the village and the walls of the town lay the wilderness, the forest, the moor, the mountain. This was not a place of recreation or natural beauty. It was the silva or desertum, a realm outside God's order. It was the haunt of outlaws, yes, but also of literal monsters. Bestiaries, popular illuminated books, described creatures like the bonacon, a bull-like beast that expelled corrosive dung, or the manticora, a man-eating lion with a scorpion's tail, as real fauna from distant lands. Wolves were not just predators, they were incarnations of the devil, their howls carrying demonic malice. The forest was where you got lost, where the path vanished, where the very trees seemed to watch. It was the setting for fairy tales for a reason. It was the subconscious of the world, where the rules broke down and you might encounter the green man, a werewolf, or the wild hunt, a ghostly cavalcade of the dead or fairy folk racing across the sky, whose sighting meant death or catastrophe. The dark, an absolute entity, night was not an absence of light, but a positive, palpable force. Without widespread artificial lighting, darkness was total, a swallowing void. Curfew bells from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire ordered halves to be banked for safety, plunging communities into a profound blackness broken only by faint moonlight or a watchman's torch. In this dark, sound reigned, the scuttling of rats, the creak of timbers, the distant howl. But more than that, the dark was when the spirit world was most active. Ghosts walked, witches flew to their sabbaths, and demons stalked. To be abroad at night was not just risky, it was suspicious. What honest business could you have under the cloak of an element so affiliated with evil? The enemy within, lepers and the unclean. Society protected itself by physically marking and ejecting those it deemed spiritually or physically contaminating. The leper is the archetype. Leprosy was seen not just as a disease, but as a living death, an outward sign of inward sin. The diagnosis was a social death sentence. A priest would perform the massive separation over the leper, who stood in a grave or under a black cloth. The ritual declared them dead to the world. They were given a clapper or bell to sound as they walked, forbidden from touching anything without gloves, and forced to live in isolated leper houses, lazar houses outside the community. They could only beg for alms with a long pole to maintain distance. They were walking memento mori, their decaying bodies a constant, terrifying reminder of the permeability of the flesh and the swift judgment of God. Their existence was a creeping horror, but one deemed necessary for the health of the communal body. The logic of the grotesque, medicine and the humoral body. To understand the medieval approach to the body is to enter a universe of surreal and often horrifying logic. Medicine was based on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a balance, sickness was an excess or deficiency. The barber surgeon's art. Your local barber was also your surgeon and dentist. His pole, red and white, symbolized blood and bandages. Procedures were performed without effective anesthesia, only perhaps strong drink or a knock on the head. But the creepiness lies in the rationale. To treat a headache caused by an excess of blood-sanguine humor, you were bled, often by leeches or venesection. For a fever, you might be given a cooling diet or bled further. The logic was symbolic: remove the excess, restore balance. Surgery was a brutal, last-ditch effort. Amputations were swift, agonizing, and survival was a gamble with infection. Trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull, was used to treat seizures or mental illness, to release the evil humors or the demon within. Pharmacopoeia of the bizarre. Medicines were not just herbs. The doctrine of signatures held that God marked plants with signs indicating their use. A lungwort leaf, speckled like a lung, was for pulmonary ailments. A walnut, resembling a brain, was for headaches. This extended to more gruesome ingredients. Mummy, powdered remains of ancient Egyptian or medieval corpses, was a prized medicinal substance, believed to contain the life force of the preserved body. It was ingested for everything from bruising to plague. Moss of the skull, moss grown on the skull of a hanged man, was collected at midnight for its purported healing powers. The hand of glory, the dried and pickled hand of a hanged criminal, was a thieves' talisman believed to render households unconscious. The line between medicine, magic, and macabre souvenir was non-existent. Food as morality, the banquet and the famine. Eating was a moral act, laden with peril. The church prescribed the eating of meat on Fridays, Lent, and other fast days, nearly half the year. This was not just piety, it was a system of control over the body's desires, a taming of the fleshly nature. But the feast, its opposite, was a world of grotesque spectacle. The subtlety and the boar's head. Banquets were theatrical displays of power and wealth. Cooks aimed to astound with subtleties, elaborate sculptures of pastry, marzipan, and gelatin that might depict scenes from the Bible or mythology. But the centerpieces were often whole animals, presented in terrifying glory. A peacock, roasted and then redressed in its own iridescent feathers, its beak gilded, might be brought to the table. A boar's head, an apple in its mouth, was a symbol of knightly courage and the triumph over the symbolic wild. More disturbing were living spectacles. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie was not a nursery rhyme fantasy, it was a reality. Live birds or even small dwarfs might be placed inside a giant pie crust, which when cut open, would burst out to the delight and shock of the guests. The meal was a sensory and symbolic assault. Conversely, famine was a constant, creeping dread. When crops failed, the world didn't just get hungry, it descended into a hellscape. People ate famine bread made from ground tree bark, fern roots, and clay. There are accounts of cannibalism during severe famines, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. But even here, the supernatural intruded. Famines were God's punishment. Starving people were not just victims, they were living proof of divine wrath. Their emaciated bodies shuffling through the streets were as much an omen as a comet. The soundscape of dread, bells, chants, and silence. The medieval ear was attuned to a different frequency. The soundscape was dominated by the church bells. They marked time. The canonical hours of prayer, called to Mass, sounded alarms for fire or attack, and tolled for the dead. The death knell had a specific pattern, 3 rings for the Holy Trinity, then a pause, then a number of rings corresponding to the age of the deceased. To hear your age being told in the distance was to receive a chilling, impersonal notification of your mortality. The sound of bells was also believed to disperse storms and drive away demons, making them a constant sonic weapon in the spiritual warfare of daily life. Inside the church, the liturgy was not in the vernacular, but in Latin, a mysterious, powerful tongue known only to the educated. The priest mumbled with his back to the congregation, performing the miracle of transubstantiation, turning bread and wine into the literal body and blood of Christ, in a language of power the people couldn't understand. The Gregorian chants, with their haunting, monophonic melodies, were not designed for aesthetic pleasure but to evoke the awe and terror of the divine. This soundscape created a world where the most important messages were delivered in code, by an authority you could not question, against a backdrop of constant, ominous ringing. A brief and perilous non-existence. The modern concept of childhood as a protected, innocent state simply did not exist. Children were little adults, economically useful from a very young age. The mortality rate was staggering, perhaps a third died before age 5. This bred a chilling emotional pragmatism. Swaddling and indifference. Infants were tightly swaddled, not just for warmth, but to shape their limbs and, it was believed, to keep them from harming themselves or being stolen by fairies who might leave a sickly changeling in their place. They were often hung on pegs on the wall to keep them away from rats and dirt while parents worked. Wet nursing was common among the elite, creating emotional distance. The high chance of death necessitated a degree of detachment that seems cruel to us. Play and pedagogy of fear. Children's toys were simple: dolls, hobby horses, tops. But their stories and lessons were not sanitized. They were told folk tales of witches who ate children like Hansel and Gretel, of monsters in the woods, of the consequences of disobedience leading to mutilation or death. They attended public executions. They slept in rooms where their parents had sex, gave birth, and died. Their psychological world was not sheltered from the harshness of existence, it was an apprenticeship in it. The unstable self, possession, visions, and madness. With no concept of psychology, inner turmoil manifested as external, spiritual conflict. Demonic possession, what we might diagnose as epilepsy, schizophrenia, or Tourette syndrome, was seen as the physical invasion of the self by a demon. The afflicted person's contortions, strange voices, blasphemies, and aversions to sacred objects were not symptoms but proof of the demon's presence. Exorcism was the violent, public process of reclaiming territory. It involved prayers, sacred relics, foul-smelling herbs to drive out the demon with stench, and sometimes physical torment of the victim's body to make it an inhospitable vessel. The person's identity was erased for the duration, they were a battleground. Holy visions. Conversely, extreme behavior could also signal divine favor. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen or Catherine of Siena, who starved themselves holy anorexia, went into ecstatic trances, and reported vivid, often eroticized visions of Christ, were not seen as mentally ill but as conduits to God. Their self-abnegation and physical suffering were marks of holiness. The line between sanctity and insanity, between divine rapture and demonic frenzy, was terrifyingly thin and judged entirely by external authorities, usually men, who decided whether to venerate you or burn you. The weight of meaning. The cumulative effect of all this is a world drowning in meaning. There was no random. A hailstorm that destroyed your crop was a message. A child's deformity was a judgment. A dream of a dying relative was a visitation. This interpretive burden was immense. Every misfortune required self-examination. What sin had you committed? Had you offended a saint? Had you crossed a witch? Had you failed in your duties to your Lord or God? The creepy things, the public punishments, the obsession with decay, the trials of animals, the use of corpse parts, the ever-present dead, the hostile wilderness, were the mechanisms of a society trying desperately to manage an overwhelming, chaotic, and spiritually charged universe. They were attempts to impose narrative and ritual on a reality that seemed constantly on the verge of slipping into nightmare. To live in the Middle Ages was to walk through a world that was alive in the most unsettling sense. Stones could have virtue, dreams were real, the dead were active, animals were moral agents, and your own body was an untrustworthy sack of humors, constantly betraying you. Privacy was the one monster they did not believe in, for in a cosmos saturated with watching eyes, of God, neighbor, and demon, to be unobserved was to cease to exist entirely. Their normal was a sustained, collective negotiation with terror, where the creepy was not the exception, but the very grammar of daily life. The machinery of order and its cracks. We have traversed the landscape of the body, the community, and the mind. Now we must examine the very machinery that held this eerie world together, the institutions and structures that codified its creepiness into law, faith, and science, and the moments when that machinery shuddered and revealed the abyss beneath. A year of fear and festival. Time was not a neutral sequence, but a sacred cycle imbued with power and peril. The liturgical year dictated the rhythm of life, each season with its own specific dread. Advent to Christmas, a time of penitence and waiting, but also of heightened supernatural activity. The longest nights of the year belong to the Wild Hunt, the ghostly procession led by spectral figures like Odin persisting in folklore or Herla, a legendary king. To witness it was a death omen. To be caught in its path meant being swept away to the land of the dead. The 12 days of Christmas were a liminal period when the normal order was suspended. Rules loosened, the Lord of Misrule reigned, and the spirit world was dangerously close. It was a time for mumming, guising, and divination rituals, peeling an apple in one strip to see the initial of your future spouse, listening at crossroads for omens. This sanctioned chaos was a pressure valve, but it crackled with the anxiety of a world turned upside down. Lent and Holy Week, a crescendo of morbidity. The 40 days of fasting and penance culminated in Holy Week, a visceral reenactment of Christ's Passion. On Good Friday, in some regions, a figure of the crucified Christ would be taken down from the cross and laid in a sepulchre, often with a consecrated host placed in its breast. The faithful would file past to kiss the wounds. This was not mere ritual, it was a direct, tactile engagement with the divine corpse. The atmosphere was one of collective, performative grief, a shared guilt for the deicide being commemorated. The labyrinth of law, oaths, ordeals, and the texture of truth. We touched on trials, but the legal system itself was a theater of the uncanny, where truth was not discovered but revealed through supernatural intervention. Compurgation's social terror. The requirement to produce oath helpers created a society where social capital was literal survival. To be an outsider, a stranger, a person with a disability, a woman without male protectors, was to be legally vulnerable. The fear of being unable to muster your required oath-takers would have been a constant, low-grade terror. It enforced conformity with the brutal efficiency of existential threat. The ordeal's divine gamble. The logic of the ordeal was impeccable within its worldview. By submitting to the hot iron or boiling water, the accused placed themselves in God's hands, inviting immediate judgment. The 3-day waiting period for the hot iron verdict was a time of unbearable suspense, as the bandaged hand became the focus of the entire community's gaze. Would God speak through festering pus or clean flesh? The body became an oracle. The abolition of ordeals by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which forbade clergy from participating, was a seismic shift, not towards humanism, but towards a different kind of terror, the rise of inquisitorial procedure and judicial torture, where truth was now wrung from the human body by other humans, in the name of a different kind of divine order. The science of the strange, bestiaries and lapidaries. Medieval science, natural philosophy, was an exercise in moral taxonomy. The world was a book written by God, and every creature, every stone, was a paragraph full of hidden meaning. Bestiaries. These illuminated manuscripts described real and mythical animals side by side with equal credence. The unicorn could only be caught by a virgin, its horn a symbol of Christ and a detector of poison. The pelican was said to revive its dead chicks with its own blood, a direct allegory for Christ's sacrifice. The weasel was believed to conceive through its ear and give birth through its mouth, a bizarre lesson about hearing God's word and proclaiming it. These were not fanciful stories, they were theological data. To study nature was to decode God's morality play. This made the natural world endlessly symbolic, but also deeply untrustworthy. A simple badger wasn't just a badger, it was an emblem of Satan digging into the soul. This allegorical lens rendered reality perpetually unstable, always pointing to something else. Lapidaries. Similar texts existed for stones. The amethyst prevented drunkenness. The diamond could only be broken by the blood of a goat. The alectorius or cockstone, supposedly found in the stomach of a capon, granted invincibility in battle. The power was in the object's essence, placed there by God. This belief fueled the trade in talismans, amulets, and relics. It created a world where material objects hummed with hidden potency, where a ring or a pebble in your pocket could alter your fate. This is the opposite of a disenchanted world. It is a world supersaturated with enchantment, where every pebble might be watching. A machine of power and paranoia. The castle was not just a home, it was the ultimate manifestation of feudal power, and its design embodied a creepy, controlling psychology. The keep donjon, the innermost stronghold. Dark, cold, and damp. Its lower levels often served as prisons. Oubliettes, from the French oublier, to forget, were bottle-shaped dungeons where a prisoner was dropped through a hole in the top and literally forgotten, left to die in the pitch black, often standing in sewage or water. But even for the residents, the keep was a place of disorientation. Spiral staircases always ascended clockwise, giving a right-hand defender the advantage. Secret passages, murder holes in ceilings above entrances, and echoing acoustics designed to carry whispers, all created an environment of perpetual surveillance and potential sudden violence. The lord lived in a fortress designed to breed suspicion. The Great Hall, the heart of communal life, but also of hierarchy. Everyone ate here, from the lord to the lowest servant, but in strict order. The salt cellar nef was a social dividing line. You sat above or below the salt. Meals were a public performance of status. The rushes on the floor, changed infrequently, concealed bones, spills, and vermin. The hall was a cacophony of noise, smell, and activity. A place where you were always on display, your manners and loyalty scrutinized. Plague, apocalypse, and the carnivalesque. When the system was stressed to breaking point, the underlying creepiness erupted into full-blown collective horror. The Black Death 1347 to 1351, the greatest trauma. The plague was not just a disease, it was the apocalypse seeming to arrive. Explanations ricocheted between divine wrath for human sin, astrological misalignment, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, and outright poisoning of wells by Jews, lepers, or outsiders. The response was a frenzy of creepy solutions. Times the flagellants, these penitential brotherhoods reached their peak. Marching from town to town, they performed public self-flagellation, their blood spraying on bystanders, to appease God's anger. They were a terrifying sight, silent except for hymns and the crack of whips, their faces shrouded, their backs a mass of wounds. They often claimed their blood had healing powers, creating a perverse, bloody sacramental economy. Times the dance macabre in reality, with priests dying, last rites were unavailable. Mass graves, the plague pits, became the norm. Bodies were tossed in with minimal ceremony. The social order collapsed as the stink of death was everywhere. The artistic motif of the dance of death became a lived experience, a hallucinatory reality where skeletonized death truly did lead everyone away, indiscriminately. Times the scapegoating, the need for a human cause led to horrific pogroms. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of well poisoning and wiped out. Before their murders, they were often tortured into confessing to absurd, satanic plots. The creepiness here is the ritualistic violence, the burning of whole communities, sometimes in their synagogues, performed as a perverse cleansing ritual to save Christian society. The carnival and the world turned upside down. In contrast to the terror of plague, sanctioned festivals like Carnival before Lent or Feast of Fools around New Year institutionalized chaos. A peasant would be crowned king, a boy bishop would preside, men would dress as women, and obscene parodies of the liturgy were performed. This was not mere fun. It was a safety valve, a controlled release of social tensions by inverting the very hierarchies that created them. For a brief time, the creepy underside of society, the resentment of the poor, the mockery of the powerful, the bodily vulgarity normally suppressed, was given the stage. It was a recognition that the rigid, creepy normal was so oppressive that it required its own temporary annihilation to prevent total explosion. The ultimate composite of fear. By the late Middle Ages, the disparate threads of fear began to coalesce into a new, potent figure, the witch. Earlier, maleficium was harmful magic, often local and pragmatic. But scholastic theologians, drawing on earlier folklore, began constructing the elaborate mythology of the Sabbath. The witch was now a heretic who made a pact with the devil, sealed by sexual intercourse. She or he would anoint herself with a flying ointment often containing psychoactive plants like belladonna, travel to a Sabbath, kiss the devil's anus osculum in fame, participate in a cannibalistic feast on babies, and engage in an orgiastic dance. This was not just a crime, it was an anti-sacrament, a grotesque mirror of the mass and the Eucharist. The witch became the ultimate repository for every anxiety, about women's sexuality, about secret conspiracies, about the betrayal of the community from within, about the power of the marginalized. The witch hunt, which would explode in the early modern period, was the logical, terrifying conclusion of the medieval worldview, a world so thick with invisible forces and moral pollution that it could only be purified by fire. The echo in the stone. To conclude this exploration is not to simply list horrors, but to recognize a fundamentally different mode of being. The medieval person lived in a psychotropic world. The food tainted with ergot fungus, the water, the constant fasting, the sleep deprivation, the pervasive fear, and the intensely vivid religious imagery would have induced altered states of consciousness as a matter of course. Visions, waking dreams, and a blurred line between perception and reality were likely common. Their normal was a vast, intricate, and often beautiful tapestry, but it was woven with threads of paranoia, bound by the ligaments of divine terror, and embroidered with memento mori. The creepy was not a bug in the system, it was a core feature. It was the spice that made the divine palpable, the glue that held the community together through shared dread, and the shadow that gave the light of faith its stark, terrifying contrast. We, in our sterilized, individualized, psychologically interiorized world, have walled off these experiences. We have medicalized the visions, therapized the fears, and hidden the dead. But in doing so, we may have lost something, the visceral, terrifying, and awful sense of living in a universe that is alive with purpose, meaning, and consequence, even if that purpose was often inscrutable, that meaning was often grim, and the consequences were etched in flesh, stone, and fire. Their normal challenges our deepest assumptions about self, society, and the very nature of reality. To walk in their world is to feel the uncanny not as a genre, but as the very air they breathed. The interior castle, mind, magic, and the machinery of belief. We have mapped the external landscape, the communal, the judicial, the apocalyptic. Now we must venture into the most intimate and unsettling territory, the medieval mind itself. For the true creepiness of the era lies not just in what was done, but in the internal architecture that made those actions not only acceptable but necessary. This is the realm of cognitive dissonance made dogma, of terror transformed into theology, and of the self as a fragile vessel in a storm of invisible forces. A battleground of invisible forces. The concept of the individual psyche, as a private space of unique personality and neurochemistry, did not exist. The interior self was conceived of as a microcosm of the universe, a little world mundus. Parvus mirroring the great world macrocosm. But this was not a comforting analogy. It meant your inner state was a site of cosmic conflict. The Trinitarian soul and demonic infiltration. The soul was often understood in tripartite terms: memory, understanding, will, mirroring the Holy Trinity. But this holy vessel was under constant siege. Acedia, the noonday demon of sloth and despair that afflicted monks, was not a mood but a literal demonic entity whispering into your ear during the lethargic afternoon hours. Scrupulosity, the obsessive fear of sin, was not a mental health condition but a potential trick of the devil to drive you to despair, or a sign of divine calling to extreme purity. Your thoughts were not fully your own. A sudden blasphemous image that popped into your mind during prayer meant perps was an arrow of the devil, an external assault you had to bat away. The boundary between your own consciousness and spiritual invasion was porous and constantly monitored. Dreams as the nightly frontline, sleep was not a respite but a shift in the type of warfare. Dream theory, inherited from antiquity and filtered through scholars like Macrobius, categorized dreams into 5 types, from the insignificant insomnium caused by physical distress to the prophetic visio and oraculum. But the most terrifying was the visum or phantasm, the apparition that occurred in the liminal state between sleep and wakefulness, where a demon or ghost might physically press down on your chest, the origin of the incubus succubus and night hag folklore. To have a wet dream was not a biological function. It was an attack by a succubus, who would steal your seed to later impregnate a woman as an incubus. Your most private nocturnal experiences were public spiritual concerns, to be reported in confession. The technology of grace, magical piety and transactional salvation. Medieval Christianity, at the popular level, functioned with a deeply magical, mechanistic understanding. Grace was not just a state of being, it was a quantifiable substance, a spiritual currency, and it required physical infrastructure. The calculus of purgatory, the development of the doctrine of purgatory created a vast, bureaucratic afterlife economy. Time in this cleansing fire could be reduced by indulgences, not yet the scandalous sales of Luther's day, but earned through pilgrimages, prayers, and good works. Chantry chapels were endowed by the wealthy, where priests in perpetuity would say masses for the donor's soul, a kind of spiritual furnace stoking to reduce the sentence. The dead were not at peace, they were in a state of active, painful purification, and their howls of anguish theologians debated might be faintly audible in our world. Your obligation to your ancestors was not sentimental, it was a debt that, if unpaid, left them screaming in a hidden fire. This created a low-grade, chronic anxiety that permeated daily life, a sense of unpaid invoices piling up in the spiritual realm. The sacramentals, holy magic. Beyond the 7 sacraments existed a vast array of sacramentals, blessed objects and actions with inherent protective power. Holy water, blessed salt, palms from Palm Sunday, Agnus Dei wax disc stamped with the Lamb of God. These were amulets against evil. The ringing of consecrated bells drove off storms and demons. The St. John's wort herb gathered at midsummer was a potent charm against witchcraft. The line between a pious act and a magical procedure was vanishingly thin. A prayer recited with the right intention was a spell. A pilgrimage to a saint's shrine was a quest for a miraculous cure, often involving the measurement of the afflicted body part of wax or metal ex voto to be left as an offering. Faith was not abstract. It was a technology for manipulating an invisible environment thick with hostile and helpful forces. The craft of the cunning folk, the underground stream. Operating parallel to, and often in tension with, the Church's monopoly on spiritual power was the world of the cunning folk, wise men, women, charmers, sorcerers. These were not the satanic witches of later fantasy. They were the village pharmacists, therapists, and private investigators. White magic as social service. Their practices were a syncretic blend of folk magic, quasi-Christian ritual, and empirical herb lore. They could perform physic, healing with herbs and charms. They practiced divination to find stolen goods or identify a thief using a showstone, a crystal, a sieve and shears, or by reading the cracks in a burned shoulder blade bone scopulomancy. They crafted ligatures, knots and bindings, for love magic or to protect cattle. A common charm to stop bleeding involved reciting a verse that seamlessly blended biblical references with pre-Christian incantations. Christ was born in Bethlehem, baptized in the river Jordan, the water stood, so shall thy blood. This was the creepiness of the pragmatic. The supernatural was a tool for solving everyday problems of loss, sickness, and jealousy. The cunning person was both respected and feared, a necessary part of the community's ecology of risk, yet always one step away from accusations of maleficence if their efforts failed or backfired. The geography of the unholy, cursed ground and thin places. The land itself held memory and power. Certain locations were nodes of spiritual intensity, for good or ill. Cursed ground, the site of a suicide, a mortal sin that denied the possibility of last rites, was often desecrated ground. The suicide's body was typically buried at a crossroads, sometimes with a stake through the heart, not out of cruelty but to confuse the restless spirit and prevent it from wandering back to haunt the living. The crossroads, a place of choice and ambiguity, was a prison for the unholy dead. Gallows hills, where executed criminals rotted, were places of terrible power. The wood from the gallows or the rope of the hanged man were prized ingredients for malignant magic. These were places you avoided after dark, not out of superstition, but out of a practical understanding of spiritual contamination. Thin places, the converse also existed. Holy wells, springs dedicated to a saint, often Christianized pagan sites, were portals where the divine intersected with the earthly. Their water had curative properties. But these places too had their rules. Offerings, pins, rags, coins had to be left, rituals had to be followed precisely. To misuse a holy well was to invite misfortune. The landscape was thus a patchwork of safe zones and danger zones, its holiness and horror both tangible and geographically specific. The aesthetics of disgust, the function of the grotesque. Why the obsession with decay, with bodily fluids, with the violated corpse in art and literature? This was not morbidity for its own sake, it was a pedagogy of contempt for the world, contemptus mundi. The pious grotesque. Mystics like Marjorie Kemp described kissing lepers' sores as an act of supreme devotion, to overcome the natural revulsion of the flesh and embrace Christ in the most abject. Catherine of Siena was said to have drunk the pus from a sick woman's wound. These stories were circulated not as evidence of insanity, but of transcendent holiness. By actively seeking out and embracing what was most disgusting, the mystic proved their victory over worldly attachment. The grotesque was a ladder to the divine. Literature's rot. In poems like the Danse Macabre or in Sermon Exemplar, vivid descriptions of the decaying body, the worms that shall eat your bright eyes, the belly that swells and bursts, were standard. Rhetorical tools. Their purpose was to shock the listener out of complacency, to make visceral the abstract truth of mortality. This was shock therapy for the soul. The creepy imagery was a spiritual technology, a hammer to crack the hard shell of worldly sin. The end of the world as a planning consideration. We think of apocalyptic belief as a fringe obsession. In the Middle Ages, it was a mainstream historical model. Many believed they were living in the sixth and final age of the world, awaiting the coming of the Antichrist and the Last Judgment. This wasn't a distant myth, it was a current event that could erupt at any moment. The Last Emperor prophecy. A common legend held that a final, messianic emperor would arise, defeat the enemies of Christendom, journey to Jerusalem to lay down his crown on Golgotha, thus triggering the events of the apocalypse. This belief influenced real politics and military campaigns, including the Crusades. The sense of living at the end of history lent a terrifying urgency to all actions. Heresy wasn't just wrong, it was the vanguard of the Antichrist's army. A schism in the papacy, the Western Schism, wasn't just political, it was a potential sign of the end times. This infused daily life with a background radiation of cosmic significance and imminent doom. The weight of witness. In a world without mass media, rumor was a primary vector for news and terror. Stories of monstrous births in a distant village, of rains of blood, of armies seen fighting in the sky, these would spread with uncanny speed, validated by the prevailing worldview. Each person was a node in a network of apocalyptic information, constantly sifting reports for signs of the approaching end. The psychological burden of interpreting every strange event as a potential divine signal was immense. Conclusion: the self as a haunted house. Ultimately, the medieval person was a haunted house. The chambers of their mind were not their own. They were tenanted by theological concepts, populated by the memories of the dead who were not gone, patrolled by demons who knew their weaknesses, and visited occasionally by saints or divine grace. Their thoughts were potential battlegrounds, their dreams were highways for spirits, their bodies were leaky, unreliable vessels of humors and symbolic meanings. The creepiness we perceive is the shock of encountering a consciousness that is fundamentally exteriorized. Their fears, their morals, their very sense of self were scaffolded by external structures: the church, the community, the visible and invisible hierarchies. To be alone with one's thoughts was to be in the most dangerous company of all, that of a soul naked before the hosts of heaven and hell. Our modern creepiness, the fear of the outsider, the anxiety of meaninglessness, the horror of the void, is often interior and psychological. Theirs was ecological. It was the creepiness of a world that was utterly alive, intelligent, and purposeful, but whose purposes were often inscrutable and whose intelligence was frequently malicious. Their normal was a state of perpetual, low-grade spiritual warfare, conducted with the tools of ritual, symbol, and shared narrative. To live there would be to experience a kind of cosmic paranoia, but one that was validated by every institution, every artwork, and every natural phenomenon. It was a paranoia that called itself faith, a terror that called itself awe, and a world of constant, creeping disquiet that they simply called life. The echo in the bones, legacy and the fracturing of the world. We have journeyed through the external, internal, and institutional realms of the medieval eerie. Now, in this final contemplation, we must pull back the lens to see not just the world they inhabited, but the moment of its fracturing, the transition from that suffocating, meaningful totality to something else. For the true, lingering creepiness of the medieval may not be its alienness, but the way its ghosts still whisper in our modern foundations, and the terrifying vacuum its passing sometimes left behind. The cracks in the labyrinth, harbingers of a new loneliness. Even at the height of the medieval synthesis, pressures were building that would, in time, shatter its cohesive, if terrifying, unity. The rise of interiority. Figures like Saint Francis of Assisi d. 1226 and the Devotio Moderna movement of the late 14th century, exemplified by the imitation of Christ, began to emphasize a personal, emotional relationship with God. This was a turn inward. While still framed within orthodoxy, it planted the seed of a private spirituality that would, centuries later, blossom into individualism. The focus shifted subtly from the communal ritual of the Mass to the inner meditation of the heart. This was the first, faint blueprint for the private room in the soul's haunted house. Nominalism, philosophical earthquake. In the universities, the philosophical school of nominalism, championed by William of Ockham, challenged the very foundation of symbolic reality. Realists believed universal concepts like beauty, justice, humanness had a real, spiritual existence. Nominalists argued that only individual things were real, universals were merely names nomina we gave to similar objects. This was a seismic shift. If a wolf was just a wolf, not a symbol of the devil, then the great chain of symbolic meaning began to rust and break. The world started to become disenchanted, not by science yet, but by philosophy. It became a collection of objects, not a web of divine signatures. This created a colder, more barren, but also more navigable universe. The printing press and the fragmentation of truth. Johannes Gutenberg's invention in the mid-15th century didn't just spread information, it shattered the monopoly on narrative. Before, knowledge was controlled by the church and the aristocracy, transmitted orally or through precious, hand-copied manuscripts. Now, pamphlets, vernacular Bibles, and heretical ideas could circulate. The single, authoritative interpretation of reality, preached from the pulpit, enacted in the ritual, began to splinter into competing truths. The communal gaze was refracted through 1,000 lenses. This was the beginning of the end for a world where everyone, from king to peasant, shared the same fundamental story. The ghost in the machine, medieval legacies in modern flesh. We like to think we left that world behind. But its echoes are embedded in our language, our institutions, and our deepest fears. The architecture of power, the modern bureaucratic state, with its surveillance, its passports, its obsession with categorization, is the secular heir to the medieval church's confessional and inquisitorial apparatus. The dossier replaces the spiritual record of sins. The panopticon prison design is the architectural child of the divine omnipresence, the feeling of always being watched, now enforced by the state rather than God. Our fear of the system is a secularized version of the fear of an inscrutable, judgmental divine bureaucracy. The medical gaze, the modern hospital, with its invasive procedures, its stripping of individuality for diagnosis, its cold examination of the body as a machine, finds its ancestor in the public, humoral scrutiny of the medieval community. The barber surgeon's public bleedings have become the MRI and the blood test, but the sense of the body as a site of external, expert interpretation, not fully our own, persists. We have medicalized the exorcism, turning demons into diagnoses like clinical depression or generalized anxiety disorder, treating them with pharmaceuticals instead of prayers and relics. The battle for the self is now fought with prescriptions instead of sacraments. Our Gothic imagination, the entire genre of Gothic horror, from novels to films, is a direct haunting by the medieval sensibility. What are its tropes? The haunted castle, the feudal power structure in decay, the restless ghost, the medieval dead, denied proper rights, the secret sin of the ancestors, the unexpiated guilt of purgatory, the decaying manuscript, the oppressive religious imagery, the fear of being buried alive stemming from both premature burial fears and the vivid imagery of the trancy tomb. Gothic is the aesthetic of the medieval worldview, repackaged for a modern audience that has lost the belief but retains the dread. Our zombies are their revenants, our slasher villains are their personifications of death from the Danse Macabre. Our obsession with serial killers mirrors their obsession with witches, the monstrous individual who reveals the corruption lurking within the community. The trauma of disenchantment and the new creepiness. The transition from the medieval to the modern was not a clean escape into light. It was, in many ways, an exchange of one set of terrors for another, a trade that left a profound existential hangover. The terror of meaninglessness. The medieval world was terrifying, but it was meaningful. Every pain had a purpose, every disaster was a message. The modern scientific worldview, for all its comforts, introduced a new, profound creepiness, cosmic indifference. The plague is caused by a bacterium, not divine wrath. A deformed birth is a genetic error, not a judgment. The stars are balls of gas, not angelic intelligences. This is a liberation, but also a profound loneliness. The universe no longer speaks. It just is. The eerie silence of space has replaced the cacophony of spiritual voices. This can feel, in its own way, more chilling than a world full of demons. The burden of the individual. With the collapse of the communal, symbolic order came the immense weight of the self. Your identity, your purpose, your morality are no longer given by God, Lord, and community. You must construct them yourself. This is the founding terror of modernity. The medieval person was never alone, even in their torment. The modern person can be utterly alone in a crowd, adrift in a universe with no inherent instructions. The creepiness of the doppelganger, the uncanny valley, the fear of losing one's mind, these are modern horrors born from this new, fragile, and isolated selfhood. The return of the repressed. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen eruptions of what look like medieval patterns in modern garb. Conspiracy theories function exactly like the witch panic. They identify a hidden, malevolent group instead of witches, its elites, aliens, or shadowy cabals responsible for all societal ills, requiring purification and often violence. The public shaming rituals on social media are the digital pillory, complete with the casting of symbolic dung vitriolic comments. The apocalyptic rhetoric surrounding climate change or pandances carries the same urgent, end times terror as the Black Death sermons, though now the agency is human or ecological, not divine. The shadow in the light. To study the creepy normal of the Middle Ages is not to indulge in morbid nostalgia. It is to conduct an archaeology of our own disquiet. Their world challenges us with its opposite, a life drenched in a significance so potent it was often unbearable. We have chosen a path of individualism, scientific materialism, and psychological interiority. We have gained privacy, personal freedom, and longer, safer lives. But we have lost the thick, communal fabric that, however stifling, held individuals in a shared story. We have lost the sense of living in a universe that is for or against us, settling for one that is merely around us. We have traded the haunted house for the empty apartment. The medieval world whispers to us from the past, not to lure us back, but to remind us of the cost of our comforts. Its creepiness is a mirror, showing us that our own normal, with its silent cosmos, its lonely selves, its abstract systems of control, has its own profound and particular eeriness. Their fear was of a world too full of eyes and meanings. Our fear, perhaps, is of a world not full enough. The true legacy of the medieval may be this: they lived with the lights on, and the shadows were full of monsters. We turned off many of those lights, and now we wonder why the darkness feels so deep, and why the silence is so loud. The eternal return, echoes in the ritual in the echo. We conclude not with a summary, but with a descent into the cyclical, the repetitive, the rituals that acted as the heartbeat of that eerie normal. For it was in ritual that the medieval world performed its stability, exorcised its fears, and wove the creepy seamlessly into the sacred. These were not mere ceremonies, they were psychic technologies, repeated incantations against the void. And in their echoes, we may hear the faint, discordant music of our own attempts to order a chaotic existence. The ritual year, performing the cosmos. We've touched on the calendar, but we must feel its weight as a series of enacted truths. Life was not linear progression but a spiral, returning each year to the same sacred moments, each repetition deepening the grooves of belief. Plough Monday and Rogationtide, the year's agricultural spine was sanctified. On Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, a plough was blessed, often dragged into the church itself, its blade kissed by the priest. This was not a quaint folk custom, it was a literal consecration of the tool that would tear open the earth, an act of violence made holy to ensure fertility. Later, during Rogationtide, the 3 days before Ascension, the entire parish would beat the bounds. Led by priest and crucifix, they would walk the literal boundaries of the parish, blessing the fields, and importantly, beating young boys or striking boundary markers with rods. The pain and the noise were mnemonic devices, embedding the shape of the community into flesh and memory, defending it from spiritual and legal encroachment. The map of home was written in pain and prayer. Corpus Christi and the triumph of the body, this late medieval feast became the ultimate expression of communal identity. The consecrated host, the literal body of Christ, was placed in a monstrance and paraded through the streets in a pageant of unimaginable power. But following it were the mystery plays, performed by guilds on wheeled stages. These were not simple Bible stories. The crucifixion plays were grueling, bloody spectacles, with actors using animal bladders filled with blood. The harrowing of hell was a booming, terrifying drama of Christ shattering the gates of the underworld. And the Doomsday Play was the ultimate community horror show, final judgment rendered in the town square, with demons dragging shrieking souls, neighbors you knew, to a spectacular hellmouth, a giant, fire-breathing puppet head. This was collective catharsis through collective terror. They didn't watch the apocalypse, they rehearsed for it together, every single year. The micro-rituals, the daily incantations against chaos. Ritual permeated the microscopic level of daily life, a constant low-grade hum of prescribed actions to keep the unseen world in check. The praxis of protection, actions. We'd consider. Superstitions were daily defensive protocols. Spitting 3 times after seeing a bad omen or a witch was not a nervous tic. It was an ejection of evil, a symbolic cleansing with one's own vital moisture. Touching iron, cold iron upon encountering the uncanny disrupted fairy magic. Blessing a sneeze, God bless you, was an urgent necessity, as a sneeze was believed to be the soul momentarily escaping the body, leaving it vulnerable to demonic entry. The gargoyle on the cathedral wasn't just decoration, it was a ritually placed apotropaic warding off device, its grotesque form frightening evil spirits away from the sacred space. Life was a minefield of spiritual danger, navigated by a meticulous, inherited dance of gestures and words. The archaeology of the self. The sacrament of penance was the most profound and invasive interior ritual. Annually, before Easter, you had to confess. But this was not a vague admission of wrongdoing. You had to examine your conscience using intricate schemas like the 7 deadly sins and the 10 commandments. You then had to articulate these sins, with species, number, and circumstances, to another human being, the priest, who stood in persona Christi. He would assign a penance, prayers, fasting, pilgrimage. This ritual created a legible soul. Your most private thoughts and actions were codified, categorized, and made manifest. The relief of absolution was real, but it came at the cost of total transparency to the power of the Church. It was the ultimate ritual of making the internal external, of ensuring no thought, no desire, could ever be truly private. When ritual failed. The true test of this ritualized world came when its formulas catastrophically failed. The Black Death was the prime example. The rituals of penance, prayer, procession, and relic veneration had no effect. The failure was so total it provoked 2 radical, opposing ritual responses. The flagellants, they created a new, extreme ritual of atonement, a bloody parody of Christ's passion performed by the laity, bypassing a failed clergy. Their whips were a ritual tool to scourge a sinful world back into a state of grace. The dance macabre. In the face of ritual failure, another response was the artistic ritual of memento mori pushed to its logical extreme. If our prayers cannot save us, then let us ritualize our despair, our equality in decay. The dance of death is a ritual of nihilistic acceptance, performed in art and later in pageants. These were not collapses of belief, but desperate mutations of ritual, proof that the impulse to formalize and perform their understanding of reality was the deepest groove of all. The modern ritual, secular ghosts. We tell ourselves we are free of such primitive ritual. We are not. We have secularized them, drained them of transcendent meaning, but the skeleton remains. The medical checkup, our annual physical, is a ritual of purification and diagnosis. We confess our lifestyle sins, smoking, drinking, poor diet, to the priestly doctor. He performs divination blood tests, scans to read the humors of our body. He assigns penance exercise, medication, surgery. We seek the absolution of a clean bill of health. It is a ritual of fear and hope, seeking to ward off the modern plague of cancer or heart disease. The therapy session. This is the direct descendant of confession. We excavate our interior life with the help of a secular guide, using schemas not of sin but of trauma, neurosis, and personality disorders. We seek not absolution, but healing or self-actualization. The ritual of weekly, vulnerable speech to an authorized listener, aiming for a state of grace called wellness, mirrors the medieval structure perfectly. The digital ritual, the like, the share, the curated story. These are micro-rituals of a new communal gaze. We perform our identities on a digital stage, seeking validation, a form of indulgence from the community. Public shaming is a digital pillory. Conspiracy forums are virtual sabbats, where believers gather to reinforce their alternate liturgy away from the mainstream church of accepted facts. Our smartphones are our personal reliquaries, holding the fragments of our lived experience, constantly touched for comfort and connection. The gap between ritual and reality. What made the medieval world uniquely creepy was not the presence of ritual, but the total, unquestioned conviction that the ritual was reality. The bread became God. The ordeal revealed divine truth. The king's touch cured scrofula, the king's evil. There was no ironic distance. The performance and the truth were one. Our modern creepiness often springs from the gap we feel between our secular rituals and a universe that doesn't care about them. We perform the ritual of the career ladder, but sense its arbitrary nature. We perform the ritual of romantic love, but know it's built on biology and chance. Our rituals feel like games we've agreed to play, not incantations that hold the cosmos together. This can produce a profound existential eeriness, a sense that all our performances are in an empty theater. The bell that still tolls. Perhaps the most haunting echo is the bell. For the medieval person, the bell was the voice of the community, of God, of time itself. Its structured existence, called to prayer, warned of fire, mourned the dead. Its sound was thick with meaning. We have silenced the church bells in many places, or tuned them out as noise pollution. But we have not silenced the need they met. Our phones buzz with notifications, a secular carillon, calling us to digital prayer, warning us of social fires, marking the passage of our day. It is a more frantic, less consoling peal, but it serves the same function, to fragment eternal time into managed, communal units, to assure us we are connected, to remind us of obligations. The medieval person heard a bell and thought of God's judgment and mercy. We hear a notification and think of social judgment and demands. The anxiety is similar, the cosmology has shrunk. In the end, to study the creepy normal of the Middle Ages is to realize that they built an entire civilization, with astonishing art, deep philosophy, and profound social bonds, on a foundation of what we would call terror and superstition. They took the raw, creepy stuff of existence, death, disease, the unknown, the capriciousness of nature, and forged it into a system of breathtaking complexity and, at times, terrible beauty. Their world whispers to us not because we want to live there, but because it reminds us that our own world, for all its rational, sanitized, individualistic glory, is also a constructed narrative, a set of agreed-upon rituals to keep a different kind of darkness at bay. Their darkness was populated with demons and angels. Ours is the void of empty space and silent gods. Which is truly creepier may be a matter of temperament. But their example forces a humbling question. What unseen walls have we, in our enlightened age, built around ourselves, and what ghosts do we, in our quiet moments, pretend not to see dancing in the corners of our own well-lit rooms? The medieval world is a mirror, cracked and stained, held up to our face. In its reflection, we see not primitive ancestors, but fellow architects of reality, using the tools they had to build shelters against the same eternal storm. Their mortar was faith, fear, and community. Ours is data, doubt, and the individual. The storm, however, has not changed. Where their world meets ours, and the door that swings both ways. We have reached the threshold. We have catalogued the chambers. Of the medieval mind, traced the rituals that were its pulse, and felt the chill of its echoes in our own time. Yet a final contemplation remains, not of separation, but of points of contact, the moments where their eerie normal touches our own not as an artifact, but as a live wire. For the true end of this exploration is not a closed ledger, but an open question about the nature of fear, meaning, and the walls we build to feel at home in the cosmos. The persistent hauntings, where the walls are thin. There are places, professions, and states of being where the medieval sensibility leaks through with particular force, where our modern insulation wears thin. In the hospital, at the hour of death. Despite our technology, the process of dying often strips away our modern certainties. The sterile room becomes a deathbed chamber. Family gather, not just to mourn, but to witness, much like the medieval community. There is often a turn, however hesitant, towards ritual, holding hands, speaking words of comfort that echo old prayers, the last rites of palliative care. The body, once a site of fitness and control, becomes again an object of awe and terror, its processes retreating from medical mastery. In this liminal space, the medieval sense of death as a public, spiritual transition reasserts itself against our bureaucratic model of death as a medical failure. In the farmer's almanac and the gardener's law, deep agriculture retains a pagan medieval rhythm. Planting by the phases of the moon, reading the weather through animal behavior, the woolly bear caterpillar's stripes, the height of hornets' nests, these are the secular descendants of the doctrine of signatures and astrological husbandry. It is a pragmatic magic, a dialogue with an animate, intelligent natural world that the medieval peasant would instantly recognize. The modern gardener who talks to her plants or feels a storm in her bones is channeling a pre-modern sensorium. In the subconscious, the dream bestiary, our nightmares are stocked with medieval inventory. The sensation of being pinned in bed sleep paralysis is globally reported as an attack by a hag, a succubus, an incubus. The shadowy figure at the periphery of vision, the doppelganger, the sense of a presence in an empty room. These are the psychological raw materials from which the medieval world constructed its demons and ghosts. Cognitive science gives us new names, but the experience remains, proving that their supernatural world was built, in part, on the hardwired quirks of the human brain. Their cosmology was an externalization of our neurology. The aesthetics of the analog, the craft as containment. In a digital, disembodied age, we see a powerful resurgence of the medieval relationship to material. The modern obsession with artisanal crafts, forging, pottery, weaving, brewing, is more than a hipster trend. It is a longing for the pre-modern understanding of making as a ritual imbued with meaning. The blacksmith at his forge, transforming earth into a tool through fire and skill, is performing an alchemy as potent as any sacrament. These crafts are slow, tangible, and leave a trace in the real world. They are an antidote to the creepiness of our own era, the ethereal, data-driven, disposable reality that can feel weightless and unreal. The artisan's workshop is a chapel where materiality is sanctified. The medieval in the modern monster. Our modern horror narratives, when they are most effective, often succeed by resurrecting a medieval logic. The zombie apocalypse. This is not just a plague narrative. It is the ultimate breakdown of the medieval social body. The zombie horde is the mindless, decaying populace, turned against itself. The safe haven the mall, the prison is the walled city or castle under siege. The fear is not just of death, but of being absorbed into a meaningless, shuffling collective, the very antithesis of the soul, the individual. It is a purgatorial horror, of being trapped in a rotting body with no hope of salvation. It is the dance macabre made viral and literal. The folk horror renaissance, films like The Witch, Midsommar, and The Wicker Man are direct conduits to the medieval eerie. They don't just use old settings, they reactivate the old logic of the land. The forest is again a conscious, malevolent entity. The community is again a suffocating, ritual-bound organism that demands sacrifice. The horror stems from the protagonist's confrontation with a coherent, alternative belief system that is ancient, brutal, and makes its own terrible sense. These stories force the modern individual, adrift in relativism, to face a world with absolute, brutal meanings. Which world is more terrifying? This is the silent core of our inquiry. Having walked their halls, can we say our own are less haunted? The medieval terror was of meaning too dense. Every event was a sign, every person a symbol, every action weighed on a cosmic scale. The self was small, crushed by the responsibility of interpretation and the gaze of heaven, hell, and community. The terror was of getting the meaning wrong, of sin, of eternal fire, of being a cancerous limb cut from the social body. The modern terror is of meaning too thin. Events are random, a product of chance or impersonal systems. The self is vast, burdened with the responsibility of creating its own purpose from nothing. The terror is of meaninglessness, of existential vertigo, of being a data point in a bureaucratic machine, of screaming into a universe that returns only silence. Their world was a prison of significance. Ours is a desert of insignificance. Which is more fundamentally creepy? There is no answer, only a choice of fears. The medieval person might pity our cosmic loneliness. We might shudder at their lack of autonomy. The door in the wall. The exploration ends not with a conclusion, but with an image. Imagine a door, set into one of our modern, smooth walls. It is old, oak, banded with iron. We pass it every day, ignoring it as an architectural anomaly, a decorative quirk. But on certain days, when the light is low, or when a particular silence falls, you might notice something. The air is colder near it. You might hear, or imagine you hear, a faint sound from the other side, not a scream, but a chant. Not a monster's roar, but the rhythmic thud of a loom, the murmur of Latin prayer, the distant peal of a bell. That door is the past. Not the past as history book, but the past as a parallel present, a world that built its reality with different tools. It is the world where the creepy was normal. We can choose to seal the door, to plaster over it with more drywall, to hang a flat-screen TV upon it. This is the path of pure modernity, insisting our reality is the only one. Or, we can do what the medievals would have done. We can pay attention to the door. We can recognize it as a threshold. We may not want to live in the room beyond, with its cold drafts and strange incense. But to acknowledge the door is to acknowledge that our reality is not inevitable. It is constructed. It is one way of being human, built atop other ways, and it is full of its own unseen walls and unexamined ghosts. The greatest lesson their creepy normal offers is this: all normality is a fragile enchantment. Theirs was woven from faith, community, and symbolic thought. Ours is woven from science, individualism, and data. Both are spells cast against the darkness. Theirs crackled with the presence of the supernatural. Ours hums with the presence of the digital. But the darkness, the formless chaos of existence, the fact of mortality, the mystery of consciousness, remains the same. So let the door stand. Let it be a reminder. When our own world feels too sterile, too lonely, too meaningless, we can listen at the oak and iron and remember a time when the world was drenched in a meaning so thick it could drown you. And when our world feels overwhelming, chaotic, and frightening, we can step back from the door, grateful for our light, our space, our quiet, and our private selves, however fragile they may be. The medieval world is not a place to return to. It is a shadow we carry, a story we tell about where we came from. And in its eerie, vivid, terrifying contours, it helps us see the strange and wondrous shape of the house we have built for ourselves, and the unseen walls that, for now, we cast in it.